Some criminals live most of their lives with a secret that no one knows about. In some cases, it's only when they're at the very end of their lives, having been diagnosed with a disease or due to old age, that they decide to come clean, and the truth about their life is finally revealed. Number 10. The plane hijacking case involving a man named D.B. Cooper, which took place on the 24th of November, 1971, is a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. But thanks to a deathbed confession that was made back in 2005, many people believe the culprit's true identity has finally been revealed. On the day in question, an unidentified man boarded a Northwest Airlines flight after he'd purchased a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle. While the plane was in the air, he produced a handwritten note, which he then handed to a flight attendant. It stated that the man had an explosive device on his person, and that it would be detonated unless he was given $200,000 in cash. He also asked for 4 parachutes, and after the planes landed in Seattle, his demands were met for fear of his fellow passengers' safety. The other passengers were allowed to disembark, after which the hijacker traveled south on that same plane. But the man then lowered the plane's air stair while in mid-flight and unbelievably jumped into an ongoing storm with a parachute strapped to his back, never to be identified. Despite the best efforts of the FBI, the man was never captured, and many theories have been put forward to explain what happened to him after jumping out of that plane. Most people believe that he couldn't possibly have survived the jump, but many others think he made it to the ground unharmed and lived out the rest of his days in luxury. Some of the money was later found buried near Vancouver, along the banks of the Columbia River, when a boy out camping with his family stumbled upon the find. But the cash provided no further clues, and the case was eventually closed. As the years passed, many people tried to solve the mystery, but to no avail. But in 2005, a man named Dwayne Weber made a startling confession after he was diagnosed with kidney disease. He knew he didn't have long to live while being treated at a hospital in Florida, and so he asked to see his wife, Jo. They'd been married for 17 years by this point, and he felt that he needed to reveal a secret that he kept from her for their entire marriage. Jo would later report that he stated, "I have a secret to tell you," after which he added that he was the famous D.B. Cooper. Jo was taken aback by this confession and, understandably, remained skeptical. After Dwayne's passing, she decided to start her own investigation into his claims, and recalled that while he was having a nightmare one night, Dwayne spoke in his sleep, expressing his concerns over having left his fingerprints on a plane. On another occasion, while asleep, he spoke of a knee injury that he sustained after jumping out of a plane. She also found a library book on the D.B. Cooper case, which had Dwayne's handwriting in the margins. Among his possessions, she found an old Northwest Airlines ticket, and she reported her findings to the police. They realized that Dwayne fit the description of the culprit, as given by airline staff members that day, and he did have a criminal history. But the authorities still do not believe that Dwayne was D.B. Cooper, since they're certain that D.B. Cooper must have passed away during his daring escape. But since no trace of Cooper was ever found, many people believe Dwayne might have been the culprit. Number 9. When someone asks to make a confession at the very end of their life, they usually do so to clear up a mystery that's remained unsolved for decades, or to clear their conscience of something they did wrong many years earlier. Once their confession is made, they usually feel relieved, having finally unburdened themselves of a secret they've been carrying around with them, sometimes for decades, and they pass away feeling absolved. But this was not the case when a man named Tony Wakeford decided to make a confession to his wife of 50 years in 2006. Tony was being treated in a hospital after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and he was certain that he didn't have long to live. Not wanting to pass away with a secret weighing heavily on his heart, he asked to speak to his wife, Patricia, and in the minutes that followed, he begged for her forgiveness. He told her that he and her best friend of 43 years had been having an affair for some time, and that he felt this was the time to come clean. Patricia's immediate response isn't known, but the betrayal that she felt from two people that she'd trusted for decades must have been devastating. Nevertheless, Tony had said his piece, and he prepared to pass away with a clear conscience. But fate had a different narrative in mind. Just a few weeks after making his admission, Tony made a surprising recovery, and he was given the news that he could go home. He and Patricia returned to their home, and she kept caring for him as she always had. But unbeknownst to Tony, his confession had a greater impact on her than he had imagined. For 5 years, anger and resentment built up in Patricia's mind, while Tony's condition worsened. And on the 4th of September 2010, she finally decided to confront him. She made the decision after hearing a certain song on the radio and felt she could no longer hide her resentment. She walked up to his desk and simply asked him why he had the affair. But rather than give her an answer, Tony started yelling at her and told her to shut up. He then got up out of his chair and started walking towards her aggressively. When she started backing up, he grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her into a corner while continuing to be aggressive. Patricia grabbed the blade, held it out in front of her, and warned Tony not to come any closer. A scuffle ensued after she pushed Tony away, and they started fighting for control of the blade. Patricia managed to get the upper hand, and she then used the blade to end her husband's life. Patricia was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to just 582 days in prison, which equates to just over a year and a half. Number 8. For 2 years, from 1980 to 1982, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of Minneapolis was under siege from a serial killer that could not be identified, and who was eventually given the moniker the weepy-voiced killer. It would later come to light that the culprit's real name was Paul Stefani, and he was taken into custody in 1982. But decades later, he would come forward with a series of confessions that revealed the true extent of his crimes. Stefani was born in Minnesota, where he spent most of his childhood. His mother remarried when he was still young, and he would claim that his stepfather would become abusive towards him and his siblings at times. He stated that on several occasions he and his siblings had been pushed down a flight of stairs after getting in his stepfather's way, and so once he'd completed high school, Stefani decided to move away to Minneapolis-St. Paul. He struggled to find a job, but got married and had a child. His marriage didn't last long though, and after his divorce was finalized, he severed all ties with his daughter. His first victim was 18-year-old Kimberly Compton, whose remains were found in June of 1981, and it was determined that her life had been ended with an ice pick. Just 2 days after she was found, Stefani placed an anonymous phone call to the police, and while weeping uncontrollably, he stated that he was remorseful over the fact that he ended her life, and confessed that he didn't know why he did it. Initially, the police believed it was a prank call, but realized that they were talking to the actual culprit when he mentioned the weapon that he had used. Attempts were made to match the caller's voice to other phone calls that had been received, and it was then discovered that Stefani had called the police 5 months earlier. During that call, he asked for an ambulance to be sent to the Malmberg Manufacturing Company and Machine Shop, where they found 20-year-old Karen Potak gravely injured, having been attacked with a tire iron. During the call, Stefani used the same voice that was heard during his second call, but his identity remained a mystery. He would go on to commit several more attacks, often contacting the police afterward to express his remorse while whimpering that he would never make it into heaven. In August of 1981, he attacked 21-year-old Denise Williams, but she fought back and injured him with a broken bottle. Unbelievably, after fleeing the scene, Stefani called for an ambulance, stating he'd been assaulted and needed medical assistance. During questioning, he started crying, and investigators recognized his voice as that of the weepy-voiced killer. He was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. But this was not the end of the case, as Stefani was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer in 1997. While incarcerated, and with precious little time left to live, he asked to speak to the police, and confessed that he also ended the lives of 33-year-old Kathleen Greening and Kimberly Compton. Number 7. When 77-year-old Harvey Richardson passed away from colon cancer in England in 2008, his family had no idea he'd been keeping a secret from them for decades, and the truth would only be revealed after his funeral when a team of interior decorators was asked to work on his house. Before his retirement, Harvey was employed as a librarian, and he was known to have a great love of literature. His house was filled with thousands of books on a variety of subjects, some of which included Germany and Russia, as well as the Second World War. It's known that he had 2 daughters, and it's speculated that he may have also had a son, but this was never confirmed. The mother of his daughters was no longer alive since she passed away in the 90s, and when Harvey passed away, his family was left with many unanswered questions about his life. After he was diagnosed with colon cancer, he received treatment, but ultimately had to be moved to hospice, where it became apparent that he was not going to recover. He eventually passed away in hospice care, and after his funeral, his family visited his house. They were taken aback by the sheer number of books that he owned, and found the task of cleaning the house to be too daunting. Hence, they contacted an interior decorating company and asked that they tidy the place up. They agreed, and a team of cleaners was sent to the house, where they made an unsettling discovery. On top of Harvey's wardrobe, they found a firearm from the Second World War and a leather satchel, which they then opened. Inside, they found newspaper clippings from articles detailing the murder of 19-year-old Lorraine Jacob, whose life was ended in an attack that took place in September of 1970. She'd been reported as missing on the 1st of that month, and her body was discovered the next day. No suspects were ever named, and Lorraine's case eventually went cold, with her attacker seemingly having gotten away with the crime. But as the cleaners searched through the clippings, they came across a handwritten note in which Harvey confessed to ending Lorraine's life, and this note was handed over to the police. DNA tests would later confirm that Harvey had indeed ended Lorraine's life, and he managed to get away with this crime until he passed away in 2008. Number 6. Mark Brandon Reed, better known by his fellow gang members as Chopper, is remembered for being a career criminal who carried out his crimes in Australia from his teenage years into the 1990s. He spent his childhood in Melbourne, and while at school, he had to constantly fight off bullies, but in the process, he became a good street fighter. His home life didn't offer him much respite, as he was often abused by his father on several occasions after being told to do so by his mother. By the age of 14, he was removed from his family home and ended up being sent to a mental health facility where he received several different types of treatment. After his release, he became the leader of the Surrey Road Gang, and he started his criminal career in Prahran, robbing other criminals who were dealing with illegal substances. After realizing that this was a good strategy, he started kidnapping other criminals and forcing them to hand over large sums of money. This was merely the beginning of his career as a notorious gangster, though, as he and his followers eventually became involved in armed robberies, arson, impersonating police officers, firearm violations, and assaults. They also started a gang war with the Overcoat Gang while Reed was incarcerated for attacking a judge, but he was in turn attacked with a blade, and a price was put on his head by the Painters and Dockers Union. He would be sent back to prison in 1992 after he used a firearm to attack a man named Sidney Collins while the pair was traveling in Reed's car. Collins survived the attack and reported the incident to the police, who then managed to find enough evidence in the car's back seat to convict him. He was released on parole 6 years later, but he remained on the police's radar for several reasons. One of the most perplexing and worrying being the fact that Collins had suddenly disappeared in 2002, under what police described as suspicious circumstances. Witnesses would later report that they last saw Collins in New South Wales on the 26th of August that year, and for a while it was suggested that he fled from Australia to Russia to start a new life in peace. The police made several appeals for anyone with information on his whereabouts to come forward, but no one did, either out of fear of retribution from the gang or because they truly had no idea what had become of Collins. All in all, Reed ended up serving a total of 23 years in prison, and at some point he contracted hepatitis C. It's been suggested this came about after he shared razor blades to shave, and in 2008 he was told he would only live for a maximum of 5 years. He decided against a liver transplant, and in 2012 received further bad news when he was diagnosed with liver cancer. He was admitted to a hospital for the final time in 2013, but before he passed away, he appeared on a television interview during which he confessed he had indeed ended the missing Collins' life, and he passed away 2 weeks later at the age of 58. Number 5. For almost half a century, a man named Satoshi Kirishima managed to evade the law despite being a member of the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front, also known as the EAAJAF, a militant group that carried out many heinous crimes in Japan during the early part of the 1970s. It's believed that the most serious crime committed by Kirishima occurred on the 19th of April, 1975, when he, along with his fellow militia members, attacked the Economic Research Institute of Korea in Ginza. The group had fashioned and detonated an explosive device that ended up doing a lot of damage to the building, but thankfully no one lost their life in the attack. This was only one such attack that Kirishima was involved in that year, and he would later be accused of having a hand in at least 6 more suspicious explosions, none of which claimed any lives. During the resulting investigation, 8 of his fellow members were taken into custody, prompting Kirishima to flee, seemingly disappearing into thin air. Most of the group's remaining members decided to join the Red Army, but Kirishima remained on the run, and he would later state that it was a tough time in his life, since he had no aid from anyone that he knew. He was placed on Japan's wanted fugitive list, but his involvement with the militia group may have gone unnoticed, were it not for the fact that his house keys were found in the possession of a group member who'd been arrested. Kirishima's face was printed onto wanted posters that were then distributed throughout the country, and it was revealed that he was being sought for his involvement in a series of attacks, most of which were carried out against the Public Security Bureau. In May of 1975, he contacted his family to state he was hiding out in Okayama, and he asked for money so that he and his 2 female companions could flee overseas. He then adopted the pseudonym Hiroshi Uchida, but decided against relocating to a foreign country. Instead, he moved to Fujisawa City, where he started a new career as a construction worker. He rented a room near his workplace and never bought a cell phone for fear he would be tracked. As the years rolled by, his career as a militant grew ever more distant, but he could never shake the guilt that he felt over the attacks that he'd carried out. In January 2024, at the age of 70, he was diagnosed with cancer and admitted to a hospital. While there, he decided he wanted to live out the rest of his life under his real name, and he confessed to hospital staff that he was, in fact, Satoshi Kirishima, one of the most wanted men in the entire country. Number 4. Being imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit must be a harrowing and extremely frustrating experience, but this is exactly what happened to 3 men who in 1980 were convicted of committing arson in Park Slope, Brooklyn. At the time, a woman named Hannah Quick owned a house in Park Slopes, and on the 7th of February that year, the fire department responded to a fire that had broken out inside the building. They were eventually able to douse the flames, but by the time they did, 6 of Hannah's tenants had lost their lives. The fire department investigated the cause of the blaze, and it was quickly determined that it had been set on purpose. Upon being questioned by the police, Hannah stated that she heard a commotion in the house that day, and when she checked to see what was going on, she saw 3 men fleeing from the house, and moments later, fire engulfed the building, and she considered herself lucky to have made it out alive. During the resulting investigation, 3 men, William Vasquez, Raymond Mora, and Amari Villalobos, were identified as suspects, and they were taken into custody. At their trial, the fire chief in charge of the investigation stated that the blaze had been started in 2 separate areas of the house, and hence it could not have been started by just one person. All 3 of the accused claimed they were nowhere near Hannah's house when the fire started, and continued to maintain their innocence after she took the stand. She identified all 3 of the accused as the men she saw fleeing from her house that day, and their fates were sealed. In 1982, Vasquez, Mora, and Villalobos were each handed sentences of 25 years in prison, despite Hannah being the only witness. She maintained she was certain of their identities and that the correct verdict had been reached. The men unsuccessfully appealed their sentences, and Mora would eventually pass away from a heart attack while still incarcerated in 1989. Vasquez was diagnosed with glaucoma while in prison, and he would eventually lose his sight altogether since he never received any treatment for the condition. The 2 surviving men would eventually be released on parole in 2012, and 2 years later, Hannah's health started to decline. Sources state that they don't know what the cause of her illness was, But she knew that she was on her deathbed and decided to set the record straight, decades after the fire that sent Vasquez, Mora, and Villalobos to prison. She asked to speak to her daughter, and then revealed she hadn't seen anyone running from the house on the day of the fire, and that she'd lied because she was certain she'd caused the blaze by leaving burning candles out, and that she would not receive the forthcoming insurance payout. Number 3. Geraldine Kelly, known to those close to her as Jerry, was employed as the general manager of the 36-room Victoria Motel in Ventura, California, from 1991 to 1998, but she was by no means your average motel manager. She was known to be somewhat eccentric and could often be seen with a boa constrictor draped around her shoulders. She had several tattoos, something that's often frowned upon in the hospitality industry, but she was very good at her job and was described by the motel's owners, Valerie and Don, as a strong woman with a good head on her shoulders. She was married to a man named John, whom she met while they were still children growing up in the neighborhood of Somerville. John was employed as a mechanic, who, according to those who knew him, was very skilled at his trade, and he was considered to be a nice person unless he'd been drinking. At one point in the 1980s, he was arrested when he was found to have been involved in an altercation that led to the passing of a member of his family. After that case was settled, he and Jerry decided to relocate to Ventura, and from the outside, the marriage seemed like a happy one. But it would later come to light that when John became inebriated, he would often become violent towards Jerry, and on several occasions he assaulted her. At first, the couple struggled to find permanent employment, and they worked several different jobs, but in 1991, they were hired as the motel's managers. Jerry took on the main duties of making bookings and overseeing their guests' stay, while John worked as a handyman. They could often be heard arguing, but no one ever saw any violence taking place between the couple. In 1992, Jerry contacted the owners to inform them she'd be running the motel alone for a while, since John needed to travel to Massachusetts to deal with his family's business there. But John never returned, and Jerry broke the news to their children that he'd been struck by a car while crossing the street, and that he didn't survive. No one thought to question her version of events, and for the next few years, Jerry and her children went about their business as usual. But her daughter always wondered where her father was buried. The owners of the motel would later recall that the day after John left, Jerry had to leave work since she'd been informed that something inside their storage locker that she was renting was leaking. She managed to sort the issue out, and no one was any the wiser that Jerry was, in fact, hiding a dark and unsettling secret. In 1998, she decided to move back to Somerville, where she grew up, and the contents of her storage locker were also relocated there. Then, in November 2004, Jerry made a confession that shocked her children while she was on her deathbed, having been diagnosed with cancer. She told her daughter that John didn't lose his life in an accident, and that she'd ended his life with a firearm after she could no longer deal with his abusive nature. She then hid his remains in a freezer in her storage locker, and for years, no one was any the wiser. Her daughter contacted the police, the storage locker was checked, and the details of her crimes were confirmed. Number 2. The assassination of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963, is one of the most discussed cases of its kind worldwide, with many people still believing that the full version of events of that day remains unknown. Several conspiracy theories have spawned from the incident, some of which suggest that more than one person was responsible for the attack, or that Lee Harvey Oswald was the man who was arrested as the culprit, and he wasn't actually involved but rather was used as a scapegoat by the government. While most people don't pay much attention to these theories, a 2007 confession was made by an ex-intelligence officer, E. Howard Hunt, who was involved in the Watergate scandal, and it's fueled the fires of conspiracy once more. After the Nixon tapes were released, it was revealed that on the 15th of May, 1972, an assassination attempt was carried out against George Wallace by Arthur Bremer, who wanted nothing more than to become a household name. It would later come to light that he also intended to assassinate President Nixon, but never got the chance to carry out the plan. Wallace survived the attack, but remained paralyzed for the rest of his life. Following the attempt on Wallace's life, Nixon decided to send Hunt to Bremer's house in Milwaukee, where he was tasked with planting material for George McGovern's presidential campaign, but he never managed to do so, as the FBI had already sealed off Bremer's house. He would later support the findings of the Warren Commission that Oswald acted alone in carrying out the assassination of Kennedy, but many people remained unconvinced. In 1999, Vasily Mitrokhin, a former KGB archivist, claimed that Hunt was named in a conspiracy theory which alleged that he'd received a letter from Oswald, his co-conspirator. This letter was then sent to several conspiracy theorists, but it was later revealed to have been faked. But this was by no means the end of Hunt's name being mentioned in connection with the Kennedy case. Kerry Thornley, a man who had served with Oswald in the military, claimed that he and a man named Gary Kirstein had met in New Orleans on several occasions to discuss ending the president's life. Kirstein had also planned on assassinating Martin Luther King Jr. and mentioned that he would see to it that the crime was pinned on a prison inmate. It would only later be realized that Kirstein and Hunt were the same person, when he saw photos of Hunt following the Watergate scandal. None of these claims were ever taken seriously, and Hunt was never named as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination, since it was accepted that Oswald had acted alone. But in 2007, Hunt contracted a case of pneumonia, and he passed away at the age of 88. His sons revealed that Hunt had made several recordings that were to be played after his passing, and when this was done, his confession came to light. He claimed that he and several others, including Frank Sturgis, David Morales, David Phillips, Antonio Veciana, William Harvey, Cord Meyer, Lyndon Johnson, and an unnamed Frenchman who was stationed on the infamous grassy knoll were all involved in the assassination, but that he had played a lesser role in the crime. While this confession certainly stoked the fires of conspiracy, most people believe the recordings to be inaccurate, since Hunt failed to include any proof of his claims, and others believe Hunt made these claims merely because he had a serious dislike of Kennedy. Number 1. 1947 was the year that changed the lives of the residents of Roswell, New Mexico forever. In an incident that became a worldwide sensation, a rancher called W.W. Brazel discovered some strange debris on a ranch close to Roswell. He collected some of the items that included pieces of what looked like tinfoil, rubber strips, and sticks. A month later, he decided to hand these items over to the sheriff of Roswell, who then contacted the Roswell Army Airfield. After analyzing the debris, the RAAF made the announcement that the items came from a flying disc that had crash-landed on a nearby ranch, and the news was spread far and wide by the media. People became convinced that an extraterrestrial craft had been found, and some even suggested that extraterrestrial beings had been found at the crash site before being transported to a secret military base. But the US military quickly released a statement in which they claimed that no flying disc was found, and that the debris actually came from a weather balloon. Brazel was interviewed by reporters, and he refuted the suggestion of a weather balloon, stating he believed the debris to be part of a radar target. Soon enough, conspiracy theorists started having a field day with the story, and suggested the weather balloon explanation was nothing more than a military cover-up to keep the public from finding out about extraterrestrials that had been captured. It was also suggested that the actual debris had been removed and taken to Wright Field in Ohio, after which the debris from a weather balloon was sent for analysis. While many of the resulting conspiracy theories were eventually debunked, Roswell became synonymous with extraterrestrials, and a UFO museum was eventually opened up there. As the years passed by, the conspiracies connected to Roswell only became more numerous and more outlandish. This trend would only continue when, in 1994, the US Air Force admitted that the debris was not from a weather balloon, but from a US spy balloon that had crashed on the ranch. As for the supposed extraterrestrials that were rumored to have been found, it was suggested that these were merely crash test dummies that were attached to the balloon by parachutes, and that nothing untoward had happened that day. But no amount of explanation would deter the conspiracy theorists, many of whom still believe that an extraterrestrial craft crashed in Roswell in 1947. The public relations officer for the Roswell Air Force Base, Lieutenant Walter Haut, spent many years denying these claims, but after his passing in 2005, Haught's family released a document that he kept secret for many years. In it, he claimed that the weather balloon story was indeed a cover-up, and that the actual debris from the crash was quickly confiscated. He had the opportunity to handle the debris and described it as nothing he'd ever seen or felt before. He was then taken to a secret hangar where the wreckage of the craft was being held, and there he saw a strange, egg-shaped craft and the remains of 2 extraterrestrials that had been recovered from the crash site. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.